And now let's talk about arranging spatial data sets. There are many things in common between spatial data and tables. So a lot of the concepts we talked about with tables is relevant, particularly about attributes. What we're going to focus on is the differences with spatial data in particular. So we're going to talk about using given data, whether geographic or other kinds of geometry, and then spatial fields, both scalar and vector, and briefly tensor. So let's start with one of the most well-known kinds of spatial data sets, which is geographic data sets, and specifically a choropleth map. That's the big word for basically the geographic equivalent of a heat map. You've got a spatial region, an area marked, and what you're doing is you are color coding some quantitative attribute onto that region. But that region is a given geometry. So we are using given spatial data rather than making judgment calls about how to lay things out. And in particular with these kind of area marks, they're interlocking. We can't size code or shape code or position code because they're given. That's not something we're changing, given that we've made this choice to use spatial data as spatial position. So we typically are just using given spatial data when the central task is to understand spatial relationships. In this case, you're looking for geographic patterns. So we've got the geography, which has got geometry of the shapes of, in this case, US counties. And then we also have an associated table that's got one quantitative attribute per region. So we can think about it that way. Or we can think about it that in this spatial data set for every region, there is one attribute. However you want to think about inputting the data, the key thing is that we are using color to encode the information. And we'll talk more about color in the second session. There is one thing to be very careful of with choropleth maps, and this glorious XKCD cartoon, which has many great examples of data science and viz issues. The point is, if you don't normalize by population density, you're going to see spurious correlations, because what you're going to notice is where people live is where you will see things happen. So snark aside, it's very important to always think about when should you show relative counts and when should you be normalizing your data into some relative thing. This is part of data abstractions. It's completely central and crucial. So this is just one example of a much larger issue. So continuing on with the spatial data, what else could we do if we have attributes associated with spatial positions? A topographic map is where we take that geometry and at many points, typically regularly sampled points, what we do is we get a quantitative attribute, which in this case is the height above sea level. And so we have a bunch of these, we have a spatial field where we have grid cells where we have an attribute, and then we construct derived geometry, which is the iso line, the line of equal contour for specific scalar values. And any of you who've read a topo map, have gone hiking, know that can show you when the lines are close together, you have a very steep slope. You can actually see on this map structures like mountain peaks. So there's a lot of information that we've constructed by deriving geometry. And again, shape is the key question here. We're trying to understand, in this case, the shape of the terrain. Now we can go from geographic data to non-geographic data as we get into the kinds of three-dimensional spatial fields that are common in things like medical imaging. Now, instead of geographic data, if we think about a medical context, again, we have scalar spatial fields, and we're thinking in a true 3D sense. It's very common that at every point in that field, you'll have sampled a density value, and you need to understand shape relationships. The two major ways to think about this kind of data, isosurfaces and direct volume rendering, are different in terms of how they attack it. With isosurfaces, what we're trying to do is to compute geometry, again with deriving geometry. So we're deriving geometry which is showing isocontours, so two-dimensional surfaces in 3D space for these specific values. So here they have carefully chosen isocontour values so that you could see, for example, the pulp of the tooth and the nerve versus the enamel versus the outer surface of the tooth. That's what we're seeing with a sort of isosurface extraction technique of deriving geometry. In contrast, with direct volume rendering, you don't actually derive explicit geometry. Instead, as the name direct implies, you have a so-called transfer function where you're mapping from these density values into directly showing color and opacity values to try to shed light on what's happening inside this three-dimensional volumetric data set. So you do not have derived geometry directly rendered. Now, we're not going to go too deep into that in this tutorial, but this is enough to give you a flavor for, again, how this understanding of shape is crucial with spatial data. Now let's think about situations where instead of having a single value in the spatial field, we have multiple values at every point. These are called vector and tensor fields. We're not going to get too deep into them, but just to give you a flavor of that, there are many idioms that have been proposed to look at vector field data. Some of them are showing with a small glyph, something like the direction of flow at each point, whether it's an arrow or a tapered line or something like that. There are approaches where you seed particles and you actually trace where that particle would follow according to the dynamics of that vector field. So you have a sparse set of seed points and you trace these trajectories. Another approach is to think of having basically white noise textures that get smeared from the moving of the particles along in that field, like line interval convolution lick. And then finally, you could actually explicitly try to compute things implicitly in these other methods. People are actually, there's a task involved. People are trying to often find these features of interest, like places where there's a sink or a source or saddle points about how the flow changes. So they're looking for these sort of topological features in the fluid. And sometimes you could just compute those explicitly. So that's an example of deriving data, explicit computation of these features, and then actually showing that a little more explicitly or with any of these other visual idioms. So one thing that's worth pointing out is that in a lot of the spatial data, a lot of very extensive algorithmic work has gone on specifically for scalability and dealing with the sheer scale, which is a huge problem when you've got three-dimensional spatial data in particular. Here's an example of a 3D vector field. So in three-dimensional space, you now have vectors at every point. Now you can imagine the challenges from a visual occlusion and clutter point of view. If you just tried to draw all of those, you wouldn't be able to see anything. And this is where we really see these seed-based methods come into their own. Here's an example where they took the original 3D vector field. The first level of derived data that they did was to take each particle and trace a trajectory of how the vector field would affect that. So a very small number of seed particles you can see over in one corner, and then looking at where they move inside that volume. But they're not done yet. Then there's another level of deriving data. Then they take, for each streamline, they try to basically measure its essentially squiggliness, its curvature, torsion, tortuosity. These are all different ways of trying to compute its path through space, combining those together into a weighted function, which they call the signature, and then hierarchically clustering all these signatures to try to find the squiggles that are very similar and actually have those be in one group. We'll talk more about hierarchical clustering later on when we get to filtering and aggregation. But for now, what you can see here is there's a red cluster and a purple cluster that they have color-coded and opacity-coded so that you could try to differentiate between these two types of trajectories, which is multiple levels of derived data in from the original raw data. Again, a key task here is to understand shape, understand where these things are in space, and to try to find some of these topological features of interest. In this case, we're talking about flow topology, not network topology. Now, the key thing here is scaling this up. There's millions of original sample points. There's hundreds of these streamlines. So this kind of computation, to be able to quickly and in real time move this around in 3D and actually have interactive response to all of these things, there's a huge amount of algorithmic work that goes on under the hood to enable this visual idiom of showing these streamlines through 3D space. So that was just a very quick brush through spatial data. And again, a lot of the issues we talked about with tabular data do transfer, and we focus just on the differences with spatial data in particular. And I will see you in the next snippet.